User preferences. So we'll go through the user preferences form and have a look at all the tabs. If you like to select edit user preferences and open up the user preference form, then you should see something like what we got here. So we're selecting edit user preferences, and let's go through each of these tabs. First of all, in the units format, these are the units that are used to display resource work. So if you're showing hour, what this will mean is that when you add a resource, you will show the work in hours. If you select days, then you'll show the work in days, and that's your choice, but normally most people work in hours. Showing the unit label will allow you to see an H behind it. You can show the subunits if you want to, and you can show the decimals. We talked here about the durations format here, and I've explained that you really should show the duration label and subunits all the time, so you can see whether your activities are starting and beginning or ending in the middle of the day. The units per time format here allows you to decide whether you're going to show the resource assignments as percentage or units per time. So if you've got a resource that's assigned at 4 hours per day, therefore it's effectively working at 50%, you can show it as 50% or 4 hours a day. So if you want to assign 4 trucks against an activity, you have to type in 400%, or if you're using units per day, 4 8s are 32, you have to type 32. On the other hand, if you change this to days, then what you'll find is that you then, because you're assigning trucks per day, you would therefore assign it as 4 days per day, and therefore you would enter in a different unit here, or you can enter 400%. I would normally use hours. Moving on to the dates tab here. This allows you to either have the US method of displaying dates, or what I will call the European or the international standard. Across here you can show the year as 4 digits or as not as 4 digits. I usually don't show the 4-digit because it consumes too much column width. I like to show the month name, particularly if I'm working on international projects where we're having some countries that are using one format and some countries using the other. It saves confusion. I put in the leading zeros because it tends to make all the dates the same width, and you have to have a separator. You can't not have a separator. So again, that's your choice. I prefer to use 24-hour rather than 12-hour. It saves confusion between AM and PM, and you can see also that it makes a column narrower. I generally don't show the minutes. If you show the minutes, it makes the column a bit wider. So the date format is something that I would think carefully about and make sure that everybody uses the same date format, and drum it into users the correct date format that we should be using. Moving on to currency. You have an option of selecting the currency from the list here, and you can hide the currency symbol and you can hide the decimal digits. These are user preferences, so each user can select a different currency if they wish. Each user can select a different currency and can decide to show the currency symbol or not. And therefore it's important within your organization that you ensure that people are using the right currency. When we go to admin currencies, we'll explain how our currencies are set up, and then we'll come back to this form again and talk a little bit more about it. Email. If your organization is including individual people as resources in the database, this allows you to therefore set up your email system and integrate it with the users. Moving on to assistance. There are wizards for either adding a resource or adding an activity. I find these wizards actually slow down my progress, and I would recommend that if you ever see these wizards, you turn them off, and just if you know how to use the software, you'll find it a lot quicker to add activities and resources without using the wizard. Next we go to application. The application startup window decides what window is displayed when you start the software up. You can go to a blank screen if you want, and no windows will be open. You actually have to use a command to open a window. If you use the same project all the time and you don't close the project when you exit P6, when you open P6 you'll open that project, and if you select the activities window, that project will be open. You'll be taken to the activities window so you can start work immediately. If you use a different project all the time, you can select projects window, and when you open up the software you'll be taken to the projects window. If you had left a project open, when you restart the software, that project will still be open, but you'll be taken to the projects window. The navigator dialog and the welcome dialog are a couple of dialog boxes which generally you don't want to show, as they stop you getting to the software and starting work. Application log file. If you have issues with the software, you may be asked to tick this box by the administrator, and that helps resolve issues by writing a log file of the commands you execute. So generally you wouldn't want to turn that on. Grouping and sorting here. This here allows you to show the ID and code of certain dialog boxes. So let me show you this. If I go to the predecessor column here, you will see here that it's got the ID and code here displayed in front of it. So if I go and group and sort by hierarchy and then go back to WBS, you see there's no ID and code here. If I want to see the ID and code, I go to Edit User Preferences and I can show the ID and code, and now you'll see the ID and code here. And if I go to, for example, the EPS, you can see I've got the EPS ID here. So if I go back to Edit User Preferences and I don't show the ID and code, or I don't show the name and description, if I go to the predecessor, you can see here that I've just got the code without the description. Or if I go Edit User Preferences and I go to name and description without the ID and code, you'll find now that if I change it once, normally it now will just give me, it will revert back to whatever the setting was. So now I've just got the description without the code. So the Edit User Preferences, it's up to you whether you want to show the ID and code or not. Set financial periods to view in columns. If you set these, you can't hide the columns. But when you create financial periods, and we'll talk about those in a minute, we can display what months. We can decide what months we want to display. So if I only want to display, for example, from 1401 to 1403, this will now decide which financial columns are displayed. So when I go and select this and close, if I now go to the columns view here and customize, I now have financial period values here, and I can see the financial period values. And we'll talk a bit more about financial periods down the track, but this is where you decide what financial period columns to see. And again, you don't want to see all of them for a 20-year period, because then you'll have lots and lots of columns to scroll through. So Edit User Preferences, when you're using financial periods, this is where you select which financial periods to view. So I'm only showing now 1 month's worth, and when I go to the Format columns and go to the financial periods here, you'll see now that I've only got 10 columns, which is that one financial period. So Edit User Preferences, once you set financial periods, you'll find that you can't get rid of them. So if you don't want to see any financial periods, just never set these. As I say, once you set them, it's my experience that you can't get rid of them. Moving on to password. This is where you can reset your password. When an administrator sets your password in the admin area, they know it. Once you change it here, the administrator does not know your password unless the administrator resets the password. Next, I'd like to move to the resource analysis all projects area, where there are 3 radio buttons and a place where you can choose a value of equal, higher than. In this situation, I've got 4 projects. Suppose each of these projects has a resource assigned against them, but I only have 1 project open. I can see the resource assignment against that 1 open project. Or I can see the resource assignment against all closed projects except what if. So it wouldn't show me the resource assignment against this project here, RAT-4. Or I can have all closed projects with a leveling priority greater or equal to, and this starts using this function here in the general tab of leveling priority. So let's have a look at how this operates. First of all, for this function to work, all your projects must be summarized, and therefore to summarize projects, you can select those projects and you can right click and you can summarize projects. Once you summarize them, then you have the latest data available in the projects view for doing analysis. So these projects have been summarized. If I right click and open the projects, you will see that each project has an activity, and each activity has 1 resource at 8 hours per day. So what we're seeing here is each project has 1 resource 8 hours a day, and therefore if we select all the projects in the activity usage profile, we'll see that we have 32 hours per day, or if each individual project is 8 hours a day. If I go to the resource usage profile, this shows the limit for each of the activities. So this is showing the limit, and if I go to the resource, you'll see that the resource is available 32 hours per day. So the resource is available 32 hours a day. I've assigned 8 hours a day per activity. So at the moment, the resource is not overloaded. If I was to reduce the resource down to say 24 hours per day, then what will happen is that you will see that the resource is now overloaded. Next thing I'm going to do is go back to the projects view and right click and open a single project. Now I've opened this single project, you'll see the resource loading here as 8 hours a day. If I go to File, User Preferences, if I select here Open Projects Only and close, I will now see that I just have this one project here and I'm seeing the data for the one project. Now at this point in time there are several facilities available for me to see the resource loading against other projects which aren't open. So I have one activity with 8 hours per day. First of all, I need to make sure that I select here Display All Projects. But I'm still only seeing this project and I need to go to Edit User Preferences. And for example here, I can say All Closed Projects with the leveling priority equal or higher than 1. This won't change at that point in time because this is the only project with the leveling priority higher than 1. So if I select 2 and close, you will now see a couple of things. First of all, I'm seeing resources from another project, but this loading is all on Monday, which doesn't look right. The reason why is because in admin preferences, when we go to options, the summarization periods may only be by week or month, and I've summarized by week. So to see an accurate display, I need to actually show my resource histograms by a time period of month. And now this starts to look correct in terms of the fact that now I can see how many resources have been assigned and whether this resource is overloaded. If I now go to Edit User Preferences, and for example, I can say select all closed projects except What If, and close. This is going to show all the closed projects except the What If because I have a What If project. If I go to the What If project here and I was to right click and open this project and go back and make this project a active project and go back to the first one I opened, you'll see now that I'm seeing the What If. And again, I can go to Edit User Preferences, and if I was to say all projects leveling priority greater than 3, I would just see those 2 projects, and again Edit User Preferences. If I go back up to make this to 4, that'll bring in all 4 projects and I'll see the overloading. So what I've been doing is with the Edit User Preferences, I've been selecting the various projects depending on the leveling priority here and whether they are What If or not. So this function allows you to review the resource loading against closed projects as well as open projects. Next thing we need to discuss is in the Edit User Preferences, the option of remaining early dates or forecast dates. So if I select forecast dates here and close, you will see that we have no change in the histogram here. If we go to the tracking view and I click on the projects that we have been looking at to date, which are these 4 here. If I right click and go to bars, you will see that we have a forecast bar, this brown bar here. So if I take this project here and drag it to April, and I take this project here and drag it to July, I take this project here and drag it to May, what I'm doing is I'm dragging the forecast dates to a different position. When I go back to the activities view, you'll see now that the histogram here is based on the Edit User Preferences, the forecast date that have been edited in the tracking view here. So again, just roll these up. You can see now that if I drag the forecast dates back again, you'll see now that the histogram will go back to where it was before. So the forecast dates allows you to do a what if analysis in the tracking view, and then you can see the effect on the histograms in some of the resource, either the resource usage profile or the resource usage spreadsheet. The next thing we need to have a look at is the Edit User Preferences, and we need to understand the interval for time distributed resources. So if I click on close here, if I go to the resource usage spreadsheet, and we can see now, let me just scroll across, and I'm going to increase the time scale till it's daily. What we can see here is that each of these resources is working on each activity 8 hours a day. If I select hourly, what we'll see is all the hours have been dumped onto the start of the day. That's because if I go to edit user preferences, we are using the time interval for time distributed resources to be day. If we select hour and select yes and close, now we'll see that the resources are being scheduled on the hours they're actually working. Once you go to this situation, you are using more memory in the computer, but this gives you a more accurate result. So if you don't want to see your resource assignment by hour, you need to select edit user preferences, and I'll suggest that you leave it as a default at day. But if you need to see your resource allocation by hour, then you need to go to edit user preferences and select by hour, and then you'll see your resources here by hour. Next, we want to look at edit user preferences, and we want to have a look at the display of role limit or resource limit. So I've set it a custom role limit, and we can see here that we have an activity 10 days long with a role assigned to it, which is E&C Manage. If I go to Enterprise Roles and I find E&C Manage, you can see that the limit is set at 24 hours per day. So this is saying we've got 3 people available, but we've actually only assigned 1 person. You'll see on the resources side though that I've got 7 resources assigned. So I have an option of showing my limit based on this table here, which is the role limit, or the number of resources assigned. So if I close and I select edit user preferences and I select calculated primary resource limits, this adds up the number of primary resources assigned to that role. And when I select close, you can see now that I've got far higher role limit based on the number of resources rather than the setting here. So again, you need to be careful when you've got multiple people looking at a project that they have all of these settings the same. And unfortunately, these are user settings, not project settings, and therefore you need to have procedures and processes to ensure that everybody has the same resource analysis settings. Next thing we need to understand is the edit user preferences, and we want to understand the difference between preserve units, duration units per time for existing assignments, or recalculate units and duration units per time for existing assignments. What this does is affect how, when you assign or remove multiple resources from activities, whether the resources are assigned independently or whether they share the work. So this option here, recalculate, is the same as effort driven in Microsoft Project, and this is the same as non-effort driven. So let's start off with preserve units and duration. So if I add a resource and I add, for example, an electrician, that electrician is assigned to this activity. The activity is 10 days. He's working 8 hours per day, and therefore we have 80 hours work. If we assign a painter, the painter is assigned independently. They're not sharing the work. And if I add a carpet layer, you see again that they are not sharing the work amongst themselves. I can remove each of these, and I can remove this one, and there's no change to the previous assignment. That's because each resource is being assigned independently, and we're preserving the units, duration, units per time for each assignment. Whereas recalculate is as if all the resources are of similar value and they're helping each other. So if now I assign another resource and I assign a painter, you can see that they're working 4 hours per day each, and there's 40 hours worth of work each. So the total amount of work against the job hasn't changed. If I add the carpet layer, you'll see now that they have 26 hours and 40 minutes work each. So again, the work against activity has not changed. If I remove them, you'll see that the total work against the activity has not changed. And if I remove this one again, the total amount of work has not changed. So edit user preferences. You tend to use preserve units and duration and units time for existing assignments in construction projects. For example, if I assigned an excavator to an activity and then 3 trucks, I wouldn't want to end up with 0.7 of an excavator and 2.3 trucks. I would want to use preserve, so I can assign an excavator, then I can assign 4 trucks and a spotter, and they wouldn't share the work. Whereas recalculate the units, duration and units per time may be used in an office situation where you have somebody doing a job and it's taking too long, and then you assign another person and they share the work. Typically, the default should be set as preserve units in duration and units per time. The assignment staffing here is used when you replace one resource with another, or when you assign a resource to a role and you need to decide which units per time and over factor you use, whether you use the original or the replacement, and which rate you use, whether you use the original resource rate or whether you replace it with the new resource rate or the new roll rate. The default is asked me each time, and I tend to leave that as it is in the default. And then I can make a choice each time a resource is assigned against an existing resource assignment or resources assigned against a role. Moving on, next thing we need to understand under user preference is the startup filters. So I've set these at current project data only and close, and therefore when I go to the resources view, I will only see one resource because this project here has only one resource assigned. If I select Edit User Preferences and I set these startup filters to be View All Data, if I logged out and logged back in again, by default, when I clicked onto the resources, I would therefore here be selecting all active resources, and I would therefore, when I come to this window, see all resources, not just those assigned to the open project. So if you end up in a resource window and you don't see any resources at all, that's because your Edit User Preferences is set to current project data, and either you don't have a project open or the project doesn't have any resources assigned to it. These come into play when you first boot up the software, but once you've booted up the software, then you'll find that these options that you change here take over. The final option here is use the following setting to determine whether this type of data will be loaded at startup. So what happens is when you load the resource summary data up at startup, it will take longer to start up the software, but views like, for example, the tracking view would be displayed more quickly. We've been through the user preferences tabs, and some of these are quite complex, and you'll actually have to play with the software and add and remove resources to really get to grips with a lot of these functions. And you'll also need to go through the creating and assigning and updating resources chapters to complete the loop. One of the more important things is it's quite simple for two people to be working a project to have different user preferences and view different data, and when they add or remove resources to end up with a different end result. These are user preferences, they are set for each user, and it's very important that the administrator makes sure that all the people are using the right user preferences, and these should be documented and proceduralized.